Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Beneath the Surface, where we focus on social, Islamic and political issues. Joining us today on the show is Dr. StephenSizer, who is an author of 2 books on Christian Zionism. We'll be reviewing his second book, which is called Zion's Christian Soldiers, and focusing on his first chapter, The Love of Zion. Thank you very much for being with us.
A pleasure.
Let's start off with, in your book you mentioned that the Bible is pro-Israeli, and that when people, females and males, were to believe in the Bible, they were kind of like forced to be pro-Israel. Is this still taking place?
Yes and no. The way that the Bible is read in many churches, no distinction is made between the Israelites of ancient history and the Israelis today. Because the word is the same in English, people make the assumption, they jump from the Bible to today without contextualizing the story of the Bible, or being taught, for example, that the Israelites in the Hebrew Bible, although originally they were the descendants, the physical descendants of Isaac through Abraham, over time God brought other nations into Israel who believed in him, and they gained Israeli citizenship and identity even as Jews, even though they were not descended from Abraham, because they worshipped the one true God. So by the time of the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the idea of Jewishness or Israel was not synonymous with physical racial descent from Isaac. It was an identification of in the inclusive nature of God's people. But that's lost largely on the churches today. So when preachers teach the Bible, they assume a continuity between Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Israel then, and Israel today. And so what I've tried to do in my book is go back and deconstruct that false assumption.
So previously the Jewish people, or the Israelis, let's say, were seen as role models for the Christians?
Some of them were. The Hebrew scriptures are in one sense quite honest about the failings of God's people. You know, there are stories in the Hebrew scriptures that you wouldn't necessarily share with children because of their graphic nature. There's one individual lady who hits a tent peg into the head of their enemy in his tent while he's sleeping. Samson is the first suicide bomber in the Bible, in that he pushes out the pillars in the pagan temple near Gaza and brings the roof down and kills the worshippers. Now, these are not role models that I would aspire to. But having said that, there are others in the Hebrew scriptures where we see God's people being led by individuals who have faith, honesty, integrity, courage, trust in God. Those are role models that we'd want to follow. But God's people have always been a mixed company of sinners and saints.
You mentioned that Christian Zionism is undoubtedly a dominant force shaping US foreign policy, and it has a big impact in the Middle East. Can you explain that a bit further?
Yes, again, another mistake that many Christians make is to go from the concept of God's people in the Hebrew scriptures to the reality we see today in Israel. Again, we think Israel equals Israel. But in the Hebrew scriptures, God's people were a monarchy with a king, but a theocracy. The government was under God, and God, through his prophets, would speak to his people and even rebuke the kings and the leaders when they failed to obey God. So it was a theocracy. God was in charge, and his people obeyed him or sought to follow his teaching. The prophets guided them, and the good kings led them wisely. The bad kings led them astray. Today we have Israel as a secular government. There is a strong religious tradition within Zionism that is dominant, but it is exclusive, it is racist, it is deeply confrontational when it comes to the indigenous people, the Palestinians. It's unwilling to share the land, it's unwilling to apply the teaching of the prophets, which was about doing justice and loving mercy and caring for the orphans, caring for the exiles, the refugees. That's absent in Israel or in Zionism today. So there's a very stark contrast between, if you like, the template or the model of how society should be lived in the scriptures and the reality we see today.
That is the situation. So wouldn't the priests of today be able to kind of have an impact on the Israeli state and remind them of the scriptures, the Holy Scriptures?
Some do, but again, in history and in the world today, we recognize that faithful, godly prophets are unpopular because they tell us the truth. And so often people don't want to know the truth, and they would rather have prophets and leaders that tell them what they want to hear. And so Israel is largely led today by politicians and by religious leaders whose eye is not on God, but on their following, and they seek to do that which is popular within their own culture. And Israel today is led by Zionists who have an aspiration to seize as much land as possible from the Palestinians, to build their Jewish state, an exclusive state for Jewish people, where there is really no place for Christians or Palestinians, whether they're Muslim or Christian. So there are godly prophets. There are individuals in Israel and in the West, Jewish, who do speak out about injustice and about the need for reconciliation, for restitution for the Palestinians, for treating the Palestinians as equal in the eyes of God, but they're not very popular and they are a minority.
With the situation Israel is in now, like with the land that it's taken from the Palestinians, isn't it enough for them to create that Jewish state that they dream to have?
Well, it depends on whether one views the state, whether one's hope is for a two-state solution, a Palestinian state and a Jewish state, or whether one aspires to create a state for all the citizens. But in answer to your question, yes, because the best defense is not a maximalist piece of real estate or having the best weapons or the highest walls. The best defense is a good neighbor. And when you have good neighbors, then you're not worried about your security. But the reality is no one's stopping Israel from taking more land, and therefore it's taking more land. It's annexing the West Bank, it's destroying Palestinian homes, building these exclusive settlements for Jews only. No one's stopping them, so what incentive do they have to stop?
Who can actually stop them, though?
Well, the international community, reflected in the United Nations, has made a number of resolutions condemning Israel's actions in Gaza, condemning Israel's settlement program, home demolitions, its unwillingness to abide by international law with regard to nuclear weapons, for example, or chemical weapons. The problem is, until now, the United States has tended to veto those criticisms, so they lack implementation through sanctions or through military means, for example. But I think that's changing. I think that with President Obama, for all his faults, and despite the victory of the Republican Party in the recent elections, I believe that American sympathy for Israel, however romantic and idealistic it is becoming more realistic as Americans realize and appreciate that Israel's actions toward the Palestinians are destructive and they are detrimental even to American interests in the Middle East.
Going back to your book, you mentioned that Christian Zionists tend to support the war and bloodshed taking place in the Middle East. Why is that?
Well, a simple reading of the Bible that is, I'm sure it's true within Islam too, divides the world into the good and the bad. You know, when President Bush talked about the axis of evil. It makes headlines. People understand what you're talking about, but it's an oversimplification to demonize whole nations as an axis of evil. You know, Syria, Iraq, Iran, or whoever. So those kind of simplistic solutions, that dualistic worldview, the good guys and the bad guys, is problematic because God created everyone and we've all gone astray. We all fail Him. We all need forgiveness. We all need a new beginning. And we need godly leaders who will lead us. But if we can follow the logic of this kind of dualistic, simplistic view of the world, God is on our side against our enemies. And when you have that world view, it justifies all manner of intolerable attitudes as well as behavior toward those we deem our enemies. We tolerate our friends, so when Israel commits war crimes, well, we turn a blind eye because they're our friends. But when other nations commit atrocities, we go in hard because they're our enemies. So we're inconsistent in the implementation of international law. We've got to change that. And we've got to help, particularly within the Christian church, in America especially, people to realize that God's will is not that we destroy nations or we kill people, but that we save them, that we seek reconciliation with them by showing them acts of kindness and empathizing with their plight. You know, very, very few Christians will say, well, why are the Palestinians suffering? What is the historical context for the refugee crisis? We need to look back at our own history and how we in the West, Europe, Britain especially, has contributed to the conflict in the Middle East so that we can do something more constructive to bring about reconciliation.
So the Middle East is mainly seen as like the bad people, and that's why we should get rid of them. What ISIS is kind of like doing in Iraq today, basically.
Well, that's a bit of a simplification, but I understand where you're coming from. I think that, again, we all have fears and insecurities, and it can be to do with our upbringing. You know, we have deep psychological convictions that are subconscious, the way our parents brought us up to treat strangers, to treat people who are foreigners, whoever the foreigners are, who are different, be it white, brown, yellow, black, whatever. And when you compound that with our religious traditions that we are brought up with to believe that our faith is the true faith and others have gone astray, or other faiths in varying degrees are further and further away from God, that justifies skepticism, fear, antipathy, hatred, animosity. But as you know, when you travel to other countries and meet people who are very different to yourself, you realize that actually the parents care about their children. Elderly people worry about their health. Children don't want to go to school. We share so much in common, and if we build on what we have in common, we would find it easier to resolve those issues on which we disagree.
So it's mainly like different religions having dialogue and different cultures as well.
Yes, it's not saying all religions are the same, of course not. But recognizing that Judaism, Islam and Christianity all share a common heritage, and we could be more greatly enriched if we could understand our roots. For example, the Islamic roots are clearly can trace back through the Christian tradition and the Jewish tradition as much as the culture of Arabia at the time of Muhammad. In the same way that Christians can look back to the Jewish faith, the Hebrew faith, and see that Jesus was a Jew. He was a Palestinian because he lived in the Roman province of Palestina, but he was Jewish in his roots. And so, we have so much in common that we can value, and that should help us deal with those much smaller number of issues upon which we disagree.
Did the coming of Jesus, his death and resurrection, and the founding of the church fulfill or postpone the biblical prophecies concerning Israel?
Well, that's an issue upon which Christians disagree. Many American Christians who have been raised on a Zionist theology see the promises God made to Abraham about the land that God gave to Abraham's descendants, about Jerusalem and so on. They see those promises as postponed in the coming of Jesus, meaning that they will be fulfilled in the future. So the events of 1948, 1967, the capture of Jerusalem, the creation of the State of Israel, in popular simplistic Christian theology, particularly in America, those are seen as the Bible coming true, especially when religious leaders say so. And the attempt to annex the Al-Aqsa Mosque, for example, and possibly try and rebuild a Jewish temple. Within that particular stream of Christianity, this is seen as electrifying because it's the Bible coming true. Now, that's not a view I share. My understanding is that Jesus is central to everything in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, that the Hebrew Scriptures are speaking about the coming of Jesus, and that in Jesus, the purposes of God, which were revealed through Abraham, through the prophets, through David and so on, are ultimately fulfilled for the whole world, because the church is the church of all nations. So to answer your question, postponement or fulfillment, many Christians do believe the Bible promises were postponed by the coming of Jesus and will be fulfilled in our generation. I think that's rather arrogant to think it's our generation that matters. I follow the Christian tradition that would see the promises God made to Abraham fulfilled in and through Jesus and his followers today. Christianity really does not have a theology of land. The New Testament, the Christian scriptures, teach us to see ourselves as pilgrims, to see ourselves as temporary residents because our home is in heaven, and therefore we shouldn't get too attached to this world and our worldly possessions. They belong to God. He's entrusted them to us. We should use them as he leads us, to be generous, to share, to give as he leads us to do so, and not cling to them and protect them and fight over them, but to see this world as God's earth and his earth to be shared. We're residents, we are tenants, we are pilgrims, we're not the owners.
That's actually very similar to the Muslim belief, in the sense that this world that we live in now isn't something that we're going to be living for forever. It's all about the hereafter, and in this world we're kind of like, as you said, pilgrims. We come, we better ourselves, we learn how to become better people in order for us hopefully all to go to heaven. And we also believe that when the Messiah is going to be coming to us, Jesus is going to be with him, and that's when hopefully the world would become peaceful. But the situation is that you said that some Christians believe that the Bible is taking place now, like with the situation in Palestine/Israel. Do you think that we can kind of like change that perspective in a way and tell people that it's only when Jesus is to come that, everything's going to be according to the Bible?
Yes, we can. I think that it's important, though, to recognize that we're not advocating passive indifference to what's happening in the world. Again, there is a Christian tradition that says we should stay out of politics, have nothing to do with the government. All we have to do is pray and wait, and God will intervene. That kind of quietism or pietism that focuses on morality and not justice issues allows evil to triumph. And I think it is important that we do engage with political issues, with issues of justice, and get our hands dirty in God's world to bring good out of it. The difference is that within Zionist Christianity, they see themselves as helping God bring about heaven on earth by doing his fighting, as we step out in faith and fight God's enemies, he will deliver us. And that was the model of Joshua. It's the model of the Zealots and it's the model of the Zionists. But it's not, I don't believe, a biblical model, because Jesus called his followers to be peacemakers, to love our enemies, to pray for our enemies, to seek to win our enemies by our superior behavior, by the way we show compassion to them in their need, to feed them. When they're thirsty, give them something to drink. Because why? Because they'll change our attitude to us. But the overarching role which Christians are called to play is as ambassadors. Ambassadors of reconciliation. That's one of the expressions used in the Christian scriptures. And you know, an ambassador serves on foreign soil. He is out of his comfort zone. He's left his home and he's living in a foreign country, and he's there to represent his country. Well, in a Christian sense, we are called to represent heaven on earth. We pray that God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And as you said, one day it will be. But we have the privilege and responsibility to seek to bring heaven on earth, but not through fighting, not through killing, not through demonizing, but through acts of compassion and mercy and kindness and goodness as ambassadors.
The Christian faith is known to have that love and that faith, and to make sure that you're treating your neighbour just as you would want to be treated, if not better. So for the situation that's taking place in Israel and for the Christian Zionists, shouldn't have they kind of went by that act? Like, for example, if they want to take more land, for example, in from the Palestinians for Israel, shouldn't they have just kind of like, you know, treated them nicely in a sense so they can get what they want?
Well, we're trying to understand and get in the shoes of those we disagree with, and that's hard. I think that we are winning the battle in America in the sense that there is a sense of unity between those of all faiths who want to see peace and reconciliation in the Middle East, Muslims, Christians and Jews. And there is that coalition, and there's so much more we could do, but I think we are winning in that books like mine and others who've written on similar subjects are gaining ground in the American churches, and American churches are being better informed. They're depending less on CNN and Fox News. They're depending more on more respectable and objective news media. More of them are traveling to Israel, Palestine, and seeing the reality of the wall, of the checkpoints, the humiliation of the Palestinians, the destruction of their homes. Americans are waking up to that, and they're realizing that this is not good for Israel, it's not good for American interests. But what we're trying to do is use peaceful means to achieve that, through speaking out, through testimony. I saw this, this is what I saw, eyewitness testimony, through boycotts, divestments, sanctions, through using our money wisely to discipline, to chastise, even to punish Israel for its actions, to make it more costly for them. So, for example, we would be calling upon the Palestinian leadership to stop doing the business for the Israelis. Right now, Palestinian police and soldiers operate in the occupied territories, but they do so on behalf of the Israeli government. So the Israeli government has franchised out the management of Palestine to Palestinians who work for the Israelis. And we would say, stop doing that. Make the Israelis pay for the occupation. Make them send their troops into the occupied territories. Don't do the work for them. And in the West, we'd be saying, invest your assets in companies that are upholding international law, that are supporting Arab trade, Palestinian trade, and not Israeli trade.
You said that the Americans have become more aware of the situation in Palestine. However, we don't really see any US politician criticizing Israel. Like, we may see it a few times in the British government, but when it comes to the US, there's nothing. It's just silent.
I believe this is, God willing, this is the last generation that this is going to be true. But the reality is that US politicians depend upon generous donors to fund their political campaigns. and the Zionist lobby has been very astute at backing both sides. In the United States, you have two main parties, Republican and Democrats. And the Zionist lobby backs both, so that whoever wins, they have influence. And they use one against the other. So in every state, in every major city, they will be promising funding to whoever is the most Zionist. And if a politician has a crisis of conscience over the settlements, over the apartheid wall, over the destruction of Palestinian homes, and begins to quake, begins to waver in their support for Zionism, the fund goes to his opponent. And so he's elected. But I believe that's changing. Slowly it's changing. But we have got, God willing, within another generation, we will see a new generation of politicians in America who will be acting more on their convictions rather than according to their campaign donations.
Really hope so, but then when thinking about it, can't the two parties be funded differently? Like, are they not rich enough, or don't they have that power not to be funded by the Zionists?
Well, they spend the money they get. Like most children, teenagers, they never save. And so the money they get gets spent, because if you think about it, you've got to win, you've got to spend, and therefore come election day, they've used up what assets they've got. But the best way to get out of this unhealthy relationship is to encourage Muslim Americans to donate to politicians who have convictions based on more godly values, encouraging Christians to support politicians for the same reason. And then we might begin to neutralize the monopoly which the Zionist lobby seems to have on the Senate and the Congress.
Thinking about it, would a Muslim or Christian be willing to donate, their money to the American government, in the sense that they've always attacked and killed a lot of Muslims across the world, not just in the Middle East? You've got Pakistan, Afghanistan, and other places as well, where they've just attacked and killed. So would the American Muslims be willing to do something like that, do you think?
I can't really answer that question, because I'm not a Muslim and I'm not an American. But if you want to change something, you have to engage to have an influence. If you boycott, if you abstain, you leave the field to whoever has the strongest convictions and the strongest arguments, or the biggest bank account. So we have to compete in the debating chamber. We have to compete in the marketplace if we want to have an influence or a share. But remember, in the American system, Congress and the Senate changes every 4 years. And so every 4 years there's a possibility to elect a new president or elect new senators or congressmen. And that's why we need to be training up young Arab, Muslim Americans, young Christian Americans who have convictions that are different to their leaders at the moment. Train them up to be the politicians of tomorrow, to train them up to be the diplomats and the leaders of tomorrow. It's possible. In the 1940s, virtually every single Arab ambassador in the United Nations had studied at one of the American universities in the Middle East. American University in Cairo, in Beirut, and so on. They were men and women who had a very positive view of America, because America had an enlightened approach to educating Arabs in the Middle East. They weren't into colonization the way that Britain was. They were into education. All that changed when the Zionist lobby was able to gain influence over the American establishment. But that relationship was a very strong one until the late 1940s. Similarly, most of the US ambassadors serving in the Middle East, at least until the 1950s, 60s, were born in the Middle East. They were, they were the children of American missionaries, Christian missionaries working in the Middle East. So they had been brought up speaking Arabic. They enjoyed Arab food. Their friends were Arabs. So they were the best advocates America had in the Middle East. Again, when the Zionist lobby came to an ascendancy in the 60s and 70s, that relationship, that positive relationship the US had with the Arab world was broken. But it can be rebuilt.
So if we were to, for example, go back in time, which we would love to do in this situation, for example, in the 60s, if the Muslims were to fund the two parties, would the relations been better, do you believe?
With hindsight, I'm sure it would have been. If the US president had listened to his ambassadors from the Middle East and not recognized Zionism, not recognized the State of Israel in 1948, the world would be a very different place. If he'd listened to the advice of his advisors, we might see Jews and Arabs living in Palestine in harmony because Zionism had not got it what it wanted.
I'd love to go back in time now just to make sure that happens. But how can, if Muslims, even in Britain, were to fund the American parties, don't you think that with the power and wealth that the Zionists have, they'll still be able to compete?
No, I don't. If you add up the combined wealth of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, the other Gulf states, Iran, Egypt, we could outdo the Zionists any day if we really put our money where our mouth is. But we can make a difference. We can all make a difference when we believe we're doing the right thing, when we're seeking to discern God's will for our lives, for our country, and for our world. We can make a difference.
Hopefully we do. Going back to your book, why is it after 40 years Israel still occupies land in Syria, Lebanon and Palestine, when Syria is actually being forced to withdraw from Lebanon?
Well, it comes back to the influence the United States plays in the Middle East today. Israel has succeeded in shaping US foreign policy to its own agenda. So the enemies of Israel have become the enemies of the United States. Those countries that are resistant to Israel's occupation of Palestine, its annexation of the Golan Heights, for example, Syria, Iran, Lebanon, for example, suffer the consequences of US displeasure. Countries such as Egypt and Jordan enjoy the US pleasure because they have agreed to compromise with Israel.
How have they compromised? In what way?
Well, Jordan, in a sense, with the greatest respect to my Jordanian friends, has given up the claims to the occupied territories. It was part of Jordan. Jordan annexed the West Bank to protect it in 1948. Jerusalem was under the Jordanian rule, Jordanian sovereignty. In 1967, that land was lost to Israel. Jordan still sees itself as the protector of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Haram al-Sharif, but it's only tokenism because Israel can do what it likes. Jordan has chosen to reach a peace agreement with Israel, as has Egypt, and in so doing, I believe, has failed to campaign for the rights of the Palestinians in the way that they perhaps should have done.
So Egypt and Jordan can actually help Palestine more than the other countries?
No, I think that what we're looking for is a combined Arab coalition that will stand up to Israel and agree to defend and advocate for the rights of the Palestinians. If the Arab world in total recognized the state of Palestine and was funding the development of the infrastructure needed to create a state, then I think we would be in a stronger position. if the Arab world refused to trade with Israel, refused to buy Israeli products, refused to allow Israelis to travel to the Arab world, then we might see Israel coming to the negotiating table more quickly. But the US funds Egypt to the tune of $2-3 billion a year. It's the second largest recipient of US funding after Israel, and it ensures that the Egyptian authorities, the Egyptian army, is able to control the Egyptian population. You've seen recently the impact of the Brotherhood's attempt to gain through the ballot box the government of Egypt and what happened subsequently to that. We're back to the old days of Mubarak, really, in Egypt today.
Yeah, in Egypt it hasn't really changed. But then there are many Palestinians in Jordan as refugees. Does the Jordanian government have that as more of a, is it better for Jordan to have Palestinians as refugees instead of them living in their own country?
There are Jordanian Palestinians who have Jordanian citizenship, and as you've said, yes, there are still Palestinian refugees living in Jordan, and there are sadly now tens of thousands of Iraqi refugees living in Jordan. In fact, the indigenous Jordanians are a minority in their own country. I don't underestimate the challenges the Jordanian government faces in trying to maintain their own existence as a state without ISIS seeking to destroy them as it's seeking to destroy Iraq and Syria. We know that many of the Zionists would like to see Jordan as the Palestinian state and push all of the Palestinians into Jordan. So I'm not in favor of destabilizing any country. I'd want to see a strong, united Jordan, but I'd want that same blessing to be true in Syria and Iraq and other countries too, and also Palestine.
We hope that the situation becomes better in all countries. But then when thinking of Israel, how come they're allowed to have nuclear weapons, whereas Iran, which it's not 100% sure if they do have nuclear weapons, is always seen as a threat?
Well, in the 1950s, 1960s, we believed that Europe and certainly America either shared technology with Israel or Israel stole the technology. It managed to get hold of it to develop its own nuclear weapons program. It's always denied having one or been ambiguous as to whether it had one, but everyone knows it does. So it wasn't so much given as more taken. But Israel clearly does have a nuclear arsenal, and in fact it has probably the fourth largest military in the world today. It certainly exports significant amounts of weapons to other countries. I think it's the third or fourth largest exporter of military hardware in the world. So it's no longer David v. Goliath, it's the other way around. But your question, why the inconsistency? Well, Israel doesn't tolerate or won't tolerate other countries within reach having nuclear weapons. I think Israel opposed Pakistan having nuclear weapons, but Pakistan was able to achieve that threshold. Again, the international community has got to be consistent. Iran claims to be abiding by international law with regard to nuclear weapons. The Supreme Leader has insisted that nuclear weapons are incompatible with Islam and that Iran has no intention of obtaining nuclear weapons. It wants to use its nuclear technology for peaceful means. The reality is that Israel's never abided by any international code with regard to chemical, biological or nuclear weapons. So again, if we are to be consistent, we should insist on the right of inspection and the right of monitoring of Israeli weapons of mass destruction, as we do other countries.
Sadly, we've run out of time. Thank you very much for being with us on the show, and thank you very much for watching Beneath the Surface. See you next time.